the time machine. The time traveller, for so it will be convenient to speak of him, was expounding a recondite matter to us. The fire burned brightly, and the soft radiance of the incandescent lights in the lilies of silver caught the bubbles that flashed and passed in our glasses. He put it this way, making the points with a lean forefinger.
Now, I want you to follow me carefully. You know, of course, that a mathematical line, a line of thickness nil, has no real existence. Neither has a mathematical plane. These things are mere abstractions.
Yes.
I understand that.
Nor, having only length, breadth, and thickness, can a cube have real existence.
There I object. A solid body may exist. All real things are...
Wait a moment. Can an instantaneous cube exist?
Don't follow you.
Can a cube that doesn't last any time at all have a real existence?
What?
It must have length, breadth, thickness, and duration.
Oh, yes.
There are really 4 dimensions, 3 planes of space, and a 4th, time. Look, here's a portrait of a man at 8 years old, another at 15, 25, and so on. 3-dimensional sections of his 4-dimensional being.
But if so, why can't we move as freely in time as we do in space?
Are you sure we can move freely in space? What about gravitation?
Well, there are balloons.
Exactly. Now, if we can go against gravity in a balloon, why shouldn't we hope to stop or accelerate our drift along the time dimension, or even turn about and travel the other way? Long ago, I had a vague inkling of a machine.
To travel through time?
To travel indifferently in any direction of space and time as the driver determined.
Good heavens.
My dear fellow, I can't believe that'd be possible.
The time traveller smiled round at us. Then, still smiling, walked slowly out of the room. He returned directly, holding in his hand a metallic framework, scarcely larger than a clock, and very delicately made. There was ivory in it and some crystalline substance. He set it on a small octagonal table in front of the fire.
I say, that's a fine piece of work.
Yes, isn't it?
Well, this little affair is only a model. It's my plan for a machine to travel through time.
What?
You mean that?
Yes, you'll notice that it looks singularly askew, and that there's an odd twinkling appearance about this quartz rod, as though it was in some way unreal.
It's wonderfully constructed.
Yes, beautifully made.
It took me 2 years to make it. This little white lever, being pressed over, sends the machine into the future.
Amazing.
Yes, and this other reverses the motion. This saddle represents the seat of a time traveller. Presently, I'm going to press this lever, and off the machine will go. It will vanish, pass into future time, and disappear.
What?
Oh, I don't believe it.
Oh, come. You shall press the lever.
Me?
Put out your forefinger, so. Yes, that's right. Now, press sharply.
So it was I who sent forth the model time machine on its interminable voyage. There was a breath of wind, and the lamp flame jumped. One of the candles on the mantel was blown out, and the little machine suddenly swung round, became indistinct, was seen as a ghost for a second, perhaps, as a neddy of faintly glittering brass and ivory. And it was gone, vanished.
Well,
Now look here, do you seriously believe that machine has traveled into time?
Certainly. Now, would you like to see the time machine itself?
Yes, I certainly would.
By all means.
Oh, very well, then.
And therewith the time traveller, taking the lamp in his hand, led the way down the long, draughty corridor to his laboratory. I remember vividly the flickering light, his queer broad head in silhouette, the dance of the shadows, and how then in the laboratory we beheld a larger edition of the little mechanism which we had seen vanish from before our eyes. Parts of it were nickel, parts of ivory, parts had certainly been filed or sawn out of rock crystal. The time traveller held the lamp aloft and announced,
Upon that machine, I intend to explore time.
The next Thursday evening, we assembled once more at the time traveler's house. He wasn't there, but had left a note advising us to continue with dinner if he hadn't arrived. So, at 7:30, we repaired to the dining room. In the midst of the meal, some 20 minutes later, the door opened, and he stood before us, his coat dusty and dirty, his hair disordered, his face ghastly pale, with a cut half-healed on his chin. His expression was haggard and drawn as by intense suffering. He seemed dazzled by the light, and as he came into the room, walked with a limp. I filled a glass of champagne for him, which he drained, and it seemed to do him good. At last he spoke, as if he were feeling his way among his words.
I'm going to wash and dress, then I'll come down and explain things. Save me some of that mutton.
So he left us, and we had to wait. We continued our meal, and eventually he returned. He cut short our questions brusquely.
I want something to eat. I won't say a word until I get some peptone into my arteries.
We stifled our impatience until finally the time traveler pushed his plate away, looked round at us, and smiled.
I suppose I must apologize. I was simply starving. I've had a most amazing time. But come into the smoking room. It's too long to tell over greasy plates.
He led the way into the adjoining room, and when we were comfortably seated, he began his story.
I was in my laboratory at 4 o'clock. And since then, I've lived 8 days.
8 days?
Such days as no human being ever lived before. I'm nearly worn out. But I can't sleep till I've told this thing over to you. It was at 10 o'clock this morning that the first of all time machines began its career. I gave it a last tap, tried all the screws again, put one more drop of oil on the quartz rod, and set myself in the saddle. I suppose a suicide who holds a pistol to his skull feels much the same wonder at what will come next as I felt then. I took the starting lever in one hand and the stopping one in the other, pressed the first, and almost immediately the second. I felt a nightmare sensation of falling. And glancing about me, saw the laboratory exactly as before. Had anything happened? Then I noted the clock. A moment before, as it seemed, it had stood at a minute or so past 10. Now, it was nearly 3:30.
3:30?
I drew a breath, gripped the starting lever with both hands, and went off with a thud. The laboratory got hazy and went dark. I pressed the lever to its extreme position. Night came like the turning out of a lamp, and in another moment came tomorrow. Then night again, day again, night again, day again, faster and faster still. An eddying murmur filled my ears, and a strange, dumb confusedness descended on my mind.
The time traveler remained silent, and we watched his white face expectantly. Then he described the peculiar sensations of time traveling, the helpless headlong motion, like one has upon a switchback, the painful, twinkling succession of darkness and light, merging into one continuous grayness as the velocity increased. And the sun, hopping swiftly across the sky, became a streak of fire, the moon a fainter, fluctuating band. Then the sky took on a wonderful deepness of blue, and trees, now brown, now green, grew, spread, shivered, and passed away like dreams. The unpleasant sensations of the start became a kind of hysterical exhilaration, but presently a curiosity, mingled with a certain dread, took possession. What strange developments of humanity might not appear? Great and splendid architecture rose up, built as it seemed of glimmer and mist. A rich green flowed up a hillside and remained there without any wintry intermission. Even through the veil of confusion, the earth seemed very fair. It was the moment to think about stopping. The peculiar risk lay in the possibility of finding some substance in the space the machine occupied. Traveling at a high velocity through time, this scarcely mattered, but to come to a stop suddenly involved jamming molecule by molecule into whatever lay in the way. But tired of the feeling of prolonged falling and the sickly jarring and swaying, in a gust of petulance and impatience, the time traveler lugged over the lever. Incontinently, the machine went reeling over, and he was flung headlong through the air. There was another long silence in the smoking room before the narrative was resumed. We were quite dumb. Did we believe? Or was it an invention? A hoax? But we listened. We couldn't help listening.
There was the sound of a clap of thunder in my ears. A pitiless hail was hissing round me. I was on what seemed to be a little lawn surrounded by rhododendron bushes. A colossal figure, carved apparently in some white stone, loomed indistinctly through the hazy downpour, in shape something like a winged sphinx. But the wings, instead of being carried vertically at the sides, were spread, so that it seemed to hover. The full temerity of my voyage came suddenly upon me. What if the human race had developed into something inhuman, unsympathetic, and overwhelmingly powerful? Already I saw other shapes. Huge buildings with intricate parapets and tall columns, with a wooded hillside dimly creeping in upon me through the lessening storm. I was seized with a panic fear. I felt naked in a strange world. I turned frantically to the time machine, set my teeth and grappled fiercely wrist and knee until it gave under my desperate onset and returned to an upright position. I stood, panting heavily, in attitude to mount again. Then I heard voices approaching me. Coming through the bushes by the white sphinx were the heads and shoulders of men running. One of these emerged on the little lawn where I stood. He was about 4 feet in height, beautiful and graceful, but indescribably frail. Clad in a purple tunic girdled at the waist by a leather belt, sandals on his feet, legs and head bare. Noticing that, I noticed for the first time how warm the air was. In another moment we were standing face to face. He laughed into my eyes.
No sign of fear or hostility?
None. A group of about 8 or 9 were now about me. One of them addressed me in a strange and very sweet and liquid tongue. They touched me softly upon the hand, upon my back and shoulders, as if to make sure that I was real. Then they went over inquisitively to examine the time machine. But I motioned them back, and realizing a danger, unscrewed the little levers that set it in motion, and put these in my pocket.
Could you communicate with these men?
To a certain extent. I had anticipated that people of the year 802,701 A.D.
802,701?
Good gracious.
Yes, that was the date recorded on the dials of my machine. I thought they'd be incredibly in front of us in knowledge, art, and everything.
Were they not?
No. I was bitterly disappointed. They were on the intellectual level of our 5-year-old children. They thought of me as a plaything and wanted to exhibit me, and I was led towards a vast grey edifice of fretted stone. The time machine was left deserted on the turf among the rhododendrons. We came into a great hall where there were innumerable tables made of slabs of polished stone. Upon these were heaps of strange fruits, and perhaps a couple of hundred of these little people dining, all clad in the same soft and yet strong silky material. Fruit, I afterwards learned, was all their diet. Cattle and sheep had followed the ichthyosaurus into extinction. I tasted the fruit and found it delightful.
Your entrance must have caused something of a stir.
A queer thing about my diminutive hosts was their lack of interest. They would come to me with eager cries of astonishment like children, but like children would soon stop examining me and wander away after some other toy. The calm of evening was upon the world as I emerged from the great hall, and the scene was lit by the warm glow of the setting sun. I climbed the hillside to get a wider view of my surroundings. Below was the valley of the Thames, in which the river lay like a band of burnished steel. It seemed to me that I had happened upon humanity on the wane. The ruddy sunset set me thinking of the sunset of mankind. I thought of the physical slightness of these delicious people, their lack of intelligence, and the abundance of ruins everywhere. Humanity had been strong, energetic, and intelligent, and had used all its vitality to alter the conditions under which it lived. But after the battle comes quiet. I mused for a while over this too perfect triumph of man, as the full moon, yellow and gibbous, came up out of an overflow of silver light in the northeast. I shivered with the chill of the night, and determined to descend and find where I could sleep. A queer doubt assailed me. There was the tangle of rhododendron bushes, there the white sphinx, and the little lawn in front of it. The time machine was gone!
The time traveler pressed his knuckles against his eyes, recollecting the dreadful anguish of that moment. Like a lash across the face came the possibility of losing his own age, of being helpless in this strange, unknown world. In a frenzy, he rushed in and out of the bushes, beating them with clenched fists till they were gashed and bleeding from the broken twigs. Then he went to the big hall where he had dined. It was dark, silent, and deserted. In a second hall, he found a score or so of the little people asleep on cushions. He struck a match and cried out,
Where is my time machine?
And he laid hands on them, shaking them. There were cries of terror and stumblings of little feet. Some of them just laughed. Frantic and exasperated, he dashed down the match and blundered outside into the moonlight, knocking some of them over in his course. Hopelessly cut off from his own kind, he raved to and fro, screaming and crying upon God and fate. At last, as the long night of despair wore away, he flung himself on the ground and, overcome with a horrible fatigue, fell asleep. When he woke again, it was full day, and a couple of sparrows were hopping round him on the turf within reach of his arm. In the fresh light of morning, he looked his circumstances fairly in the face and reasoned with himself.
Suppose the worst. Suppose the machine altogether lost, perhaps destroyed. I must be calm and patient, learn the way of the people and the means of getting materials and tools, so that in the end perhaps I may make another. In any event, the machine has probably only been taken away, and I've but to find its hiding place and recover it by force or cunning.
And with that, the time traveler scrambled to his feet and looked about him. Some of the little folk came by, and he tried to question them, pointing and gesticulating, but they ran away, maddeningly chattering and laughing. Marks on the turf seemed to lead to the pedestal of the white sphinx, evidently hollow, as the place where the time machine was hidden. But any attempt to force it open or to elicit help from these pretty creatures failed utterly. They seemed horrified and insulted at the idea. He wandered off again towards the hill, and all at once the humor of the situation came into his mind. All the years spent in study and toil to get into the future age, and now his passion of anxiety to get out of it. He laughed aloud in spite of himself.
I had made myself the most complicated and the most hopeless trap that ever a man devised. On the hillside I noticed certain circular wells, several, as it seemed to me, of a very great depth. I peered down the shafted darkness of one of these, and heard from below a sound, thud, 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 like the beating of some big engine. Then from behind me I heard a cry. One of a group of little people bathing in the river was seized with a cramp and was drifting downstream. It will give you an idea, therefore, of the strange deficiency in these creatures that none made the slightest attempt to rescue the weakly crying little thing drowning before their eyes. I ran quickly down the hill and into the water, caught the poor mite and drew her safe to land. A sharp rubbing of the limbs soon brought her round, and I had the satisfaction of seeing she was all right before I left her. I'd got to such a low estimate of her kind that I didn't expect any gratitude from her. In that, however, I was wrong. This happened in the morning. In the afternoon, I met my little woman, as I believe it was, as I was returning to my center from an exploration. And she received me with cries of delight and presented me with a big garland of flowers, evidently made for me and me alone. We sat together and engaged in a conversation chiefly of smiles. Her friendliness affected me exactly as a child's might have done. We passed each other flowers, and she kissed my hands. I did the same to hers. Then I tried talk, and found that her name was Weena. That was the beginning of a queer friendship which lasted a week, and ended, as I will tell you. She wanted to be with me always, and for the 5 nights of our acquaintance slept with her head pillowed on my arm. But one night I awoke with a start, and with an odd fancy that some greyish animal had just rushed out of the chamber. I got up and went out. The moon was setting. Up the hill, I thought I could see ghosts, pale ape-like creatures carrying some dark body. When the sun rose, I wandered into one of the ruined buildings on the hillside. Suddenly I halted spellbound. A pair of eyes, luminous against the daylight without, was watching me out of the darkness. The old instinctive dread of wild beasts came upon me. I was afraid to turn. The thought of the absolute security that humanity appeared to be living in came to my mind. Then I remembered the strange terror of the dark I had noticed among the people, Weena especially, and how at night they always gathered together and slept in droves. I put out my hand and touched something soft. At once the eyes darted sideways and something white ran past me. It had large greyish red eyes and flaxen hair on its head and down its back. It vanished down one of the round well-like openings of which I've told you. I lit a match and, looking down, saw the creature regarding me steadfastly with large bright eyes. It made me shudder. It was so like a human spider, and it clambered down the wall by a number of metal foot and hand rests, then disappeared. As I gazed down the shaft, the truth dawned on me. That man had not remained one species, but had differentiated into 2 distinct animals. That my graceful children of the upper world were not the sole descendants of our generation, but that this bleached, obscene, nocturnal thing which had flashed before me was also heir to all the ages.
The time traveler learned that the undergrounders were called the Morlocks, and those of the upper world the Eloi. But which were the masters and which the laborers? It was certain that the Morlocks had taken the time machine, and they seemed to be the laborers. But if the Eloi were masters, why could they not restore the machine to him? He questioned Weena, but she immediately became terrified. And when he insisted that he explore the wells, in the depths of which the Morlocks apparently dwelt, she became distraught and tried to prevent him. But he thrust her away and clambered down the shaft, clinging to the metallic projections in the walls. For one dreadful moment, when one of these bent under his weight, he hung suspended by one hand over the blackness beneath. But he managed to save himself. And he continued his descent. The thudding sound of a machine below grew louder and more oppressive. The time traveler could not remember how long he climbed. It seemed endless.
I was in an agony of discomfort. At last I saw, dimly, coming up a foot to the right of me, a slender loophole in the wall. Swinging myself in, I found it was the aperture of a narrow horizontal tunnel in which I could lie down and rest. The air was full of the throb and hum of machinery, evidently pumping air down the shaft, and I must have dozed for a few minutes in the blackness. I was aroused by a soft hand touching my face. Ah! Starting up, I snatched at my matches and hastily striking one, I saw 3 stooping white creatures retreating from the light. Living as they did in what appeared to be impenetrable darkness, their eyes were abnormally large and sensitive, like the pupils of the abysmal fishes. As soon as I struck the match, they fled incontinently. I felt my way along the tunnel. The noise of the machinery grew louder. Presently the walls fell away from me, and I came to a large open space. And striking another match, I saw big machines rise out of the dimness, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. A metal table was prepared for a meal. The Morlocks, at any rate, were carnivorous. A huge red joint lay before them. I wondered what animal had furnished it. The match burned down and stung my fingers. I found now that I had only 4 matches left.
Wasn't it rather foolhardy to venture in there alone and unprotected? Surely you had a gun, or at least a lamp of some kind.
No. I had rashly assumed that the men of the future would be so far in advance of ourselves that I would have no need of protection or appliances. I came quite unprepared, without arms, medicine, light, even without tobacco. If only I'd thought of bringing a camera.
Well, not much help to you at this moment.
What happened then?
As I said, I had 4 matches left. And while I stood in the dark, a hand touched mine. Lank fingers came feeling over my face. And I was sensible of a peculiar, unpleasant odor. I fancied I heard a breathing of a crowd of those dreadful little beings about me. I shouted at them as loud as I could. They started away, and then I could feel them approaching me again, whispering odd sounds to each other. I struck another match and retreated to the narrow tunnel. But in another moment I was clutched by several hands. I struck another light and waved it in their faces, those pale, chinless faces with great lidless eyes. When that match went out, I struck another, then another. The last. But I had my hand on the climbing bars now, and kicking violently, I disengaged myself from the clutches of the Morlocks and speedily clambered up the shaft. The climb seemed interminable, and a desperate sickness came upon me. But at last, I got over the well mouth somehow, and staggered out into the blinding sunlight. I fell upon my face. Even the soil smelt sweet and clean. I remember Weena kissing my hands and ears, and the voices of others among the Eloi. Then, for a time, I was insensible.
The time traveler paused, put his hand into his pocket, and silently placed 2 withered flowers upon the little table.
In changing my jacket, I found my pockets always puzzled Weena. She thought they were an eccentric kind of vase for floral decoration. She...
He was unable for some minutes to continue. But then he told us how he carried Weena on his shoulder to seek refuge from the Morlocks in a distant ruin he had observed during his explorations. It was a palace of green porcelain, some relic of an old civilization. On reaching it, he found it was some kind of geological museum. Specimens of rock formations, appliances, materials, and machinery were set out in the various rooms, collecting the dust of ages. A smell of camphor in the air encouraged him to search further. And quite unexpectedly he found preserved, as an historical curiosity in an airtight case, a box of matches.
Ah!
He tried them eagerly. They were perfectly good, not even damp. And he was able to break off an iron lever from a disused machine to use as a weapon. He felt almost happy, and to Wiener's delight lit some of the matches and waved them to and fro. Then he whistled a tune, and they solemnly performed a ritual dance together, part step dance, part original, part a modest can-can. The time traveler leapt up gaily and demonstrated for us as he remembered it. But he suddenly grew serious.
I still think the preservation of that box of matches for immemorial years a most strange thing. And I found, as I had hoped, a small supply of camphor in another hermetically sealed jar. I could now make a lasting flame. We found fruit trees in a courtyard within the palace and ate our fill, then rested. But night was creeping upon us, and an inaccessible hiding place had yet to be found. That troubled me less than it should. I had my defenses, matches, camphor if a blaze was needed, and my iron crowbar. It seemed best to pass the night in the open, protected by fire. We emerged from the palace while the sun was still in part above the horizon. I was determined to reach the White Sphinx early the next morning and force my way to the time machine. As we went along, I gathered sticks and dried grass, and thus loaded, our progress was slower than I had anticipated. We were both tired, but a sense of impending calamity that should indeed have served me as a warning drove me onward. I felt sleep coming upon me, and the Morlocks with it. And while we hesitated before plunging into the forest that lay ahead, I saw among the black bushes around us 3 crouching figures. The forest, I calculated, was rather less than a mile across. If we could get through it to the bare hillside, there, as it seemed to me, was an altogether safe resting place. I thought, with my matches and my camphor, I could keep our path illuminated through the woods, and rather reluctantly I had to abandon my firewood to do this. Then it came into my head that I would amaze these Morlocks by lighting it now. The red tongues that soon went licking up my heap of wood were an entirely new and strange thing to Weena. She wanted to run and play with it. I believe she would have cast herself into it had I not restrained her. But I caught her up, and in spite of her struggles, plunged ever more deeply into the forest. It was very black, and Weena clung to me convulsively. Then I became aware of a pattering about me, and the same queer sounds and voices I had heard in the underworld. The Morlocks were closing in on us, and indeed in another minute I felt a tug at my coat and a touch on my arm. Weena shivered violently and became very still. It was time to light another match, but to get one I had to put her down, and as I fumbled with my pocket, a struggle began in the darkness about my knees, perfectly silent on her part, and with the same peculiar cooing sounds from the Morlocks. Soft little hands, too, were creeping over my back and neck. The match scratched and fizzed. I lit the camphor and flung it on the ground, and as it spit and flared up and drove back the Morlocks, I knelt down and lifted Weena, set her carefully on my shoulder, and rose to push on. The whole wood seemed full of the stir and murmur of a great company. Now there came a horrible realization. I had not the faintest idea in what direction lay my path. I determined to build a fire and encamp where we were. So I put Weena, still motionless, down upon a turfy bowl and began to collect sticks and leaves. Here and there in the darkness, the Morlock's eyes shone like carbuncles. As the fire burned brighter, the smoke beat over towards me and must have made me heavy of a sudden. I felt very weary and sat down. I seemed just to nod and then open my eyes. Suddenly, the Morlocks had their hands on me. Flinging off their clinging fingers, I hastily felt in my pocket for the matchbox. And it was gone. I knew what had happened. I had slept, and my fire had gone out. The bitterness of death came over my soul. I was caught by the neck, by the hair, by the arms, and pulled down. I rolled over on the ground, and my hand came against my iron lever. It gave me strength. I struggled up, shaking the human rats from me, and the strange exaltation that so often seems to accompany fighting came upon me, though I knew that both I and Weena were lost. And in that terrible moment, I realized the significance of that red joint I had seen underground on the Morlocks' table. The gentle Eloi were but fatted cattle which the ant-like Morlocks preserved and preyed upon. But I determined to make them pay for their meat, and with my back to a tree swung the iron bar before me. Their voices seemed to rise to a higher pitch of excitement, and their movements grew faster. Then suddenly came hope. The Morlocks seemed afraid, and I saw with incredulous surprise an incessant stream of them running from behind me and into the wood in front. I smelt burning, and through the black pillars of the nearest trees, the flames of the burning forest. It was my first fire coming after me. I looked for Weena, but she was gone. The hissing and crackling behind me, the explosive thud as each fresh tree burst into flame, left little time for reflection. My iron bar still gripped, I followed in the Morlock's path, and at last emerged upon a small open space. And now I was to see the most weird and horrible thing, I think, of all that I beheld in that future age. This whole space was as bright as day, with the reflection of the fire. In the center was a hillock or tumulus, surmounted by a scorched hawthorn. Here, 30 or 40 Morlocks, dazzled by the light and heat, were blundering hither and thither against each other in their bewilderment. At first, I didn't realize their blindness, and struck furiously at them with my bar. But when I had watched the gestures of one of them, groping under the hawthorn against the red sky, and heard their moans, I was assured of their absolute helplessness and misery in the glare, and I struck no more of them. Thrice I saw Morlocks put their heads down in a kind of agony and rush into the flames. I thought I was living a nightmare. I bit myself and screamed and called upon God to let me awake. But in the end, above the subsiding red of the fire and the streaming masses of black smoke and the diminishing numbers of these dim creatures, came the white light of the day. I searched for traces of Weena, but there were none. It was plain that they had left her poor little body in the forest. At least it had escaped the awful fate to which it had been destined. I limped my way across smoking ashes and among black stems. I walked slowly, for I was almost exhausted as well as lame, and I felt the intensest wretchedness for the horrible death of little Weena. I came back to the lawn in front of the White Sphinx, and lay down and slept all that day on the soft turf. I awoke just before the sun set, and went over to the Sphinx. I had my crowbar in one hand, and with the other played with some loose matches I had luckily found still in my pocket. And now came a most unexpected thing. The bronze panels of the pedestal were open. I entered. Within, on a raised place in the corner, was the time machine. I had the small levers in my pocket, so here, after all my preparations for the siege of the White Sphinx, was a meek surrender. I threw my iron bar away, almost sorry not to use it. At that instant, the bronze panel sprang shut with a clang. I was in the dark, trapped. So the Morlocks thought. I chuckled gleefully. I could already hear their murmuring laughter as they came towards me. Very calmly, I tried to strike a match. I had only to fix on the levers and depart like a ghost. But I had overlooked one thing. The matches were of that abominable kind that light only on the box. Morlocks. The little brutes were close upon me. One touched me. I made a sweeping blow in the dark at them with the levers and began to scramble into the saddle of the machine. Then came one hand upon me and then another. I had simply to fight against their persistent fingers for my levers and at the same time feel for the studs over which these fitted. But at last they were fixed and the forward lever pressed over. The clinging hand slipped from me. The darkness presently fell from my eyes, and I found myself in the same grey light and tumult I have already described.
One dial of the time machine recorded days, another thousands of days, another millions of days, and another thousands of millions. When the time traveler recovered himself after the excitement of his escape, he found that he had pushed the lever as far forward as it would go, and the thousand's hand was sweeping round as fast as the second's hand of a watch into futurity. As he drove on, a change crept over the appearance of things. The palpitating greyness grew darker. Then, though still traveling with prodigious velocity, the alternations of night and day grew slower and slower. And so did the passage of the sun across the sky, until they seemed to stretch through centuries. At length the sun, red and very large, halted motionless upon the horizon. The earth had come to rest with one face to the sun, even as in our time the moon faces the earth. Very cautiously, he began to reverse his motion through time. Slower and slower went the circling hands of the indicators, still slower, until the dim outlines of a desolate beach grew visible. Carefully he brought the machine to a halt and looked about him. The sky was no longer blue. Northeastward it was inky black, and out of the blackness shone brightly and steadily the pale white stars. Overhead it was a deep Indian red and starless, and southeastward it grew brighter to a glowing scarlet, where cut by the horizon lay the huge hull of the sun. A vast sea stretched away to the southwest. There were no waves. Only a slight oily swell rose and fell like a gentle breathing. With a harsh scream, a thing like a giant white butterfly fluttered up into the sky and disappeared over some low hillocks. Suddenly, quite close, he saw what had seemed to be a reddish mass of rock advancing towards him. It was a monstrous, crab-like creature, its big claws swaying, its long antennae like carters' whips waving and feeling. One of them was just touching his face. All at once he found it hard to breathe, and he saw dozens of these monsters hovering about him. Shuddering, he pressed the lever and moved on 100 years. It was still the same beach, the same abominable desolation. The same sun, a little larger, a little duller. The same crowd of earthy crustacea creeping in and out among the green weed and the red rocks. The thin, chill air hurt his lungs. He traveled then in great strides of 1,000 years or more, watching with a strange fascination the sun grow larger and duller, until more than 30 million years hence, it had come to obscure nearly 1/10 part of the darkling heavens. It was bitterly cold, and flakes of snow were falling. There were fringes of ice along the sea margin, with drifting masses further out. But the main expanse of that salt ocean, all bloody under the eternal sunset, was still unfrozen. He looked about him to see if any traces of animal life remained, and fancied he saw some black object on a distant sandbank. It was hopping fitfully about. Suddenly, the outline of the sun changed, and a concavity, a bay, appeared in its curve. He saw it grow larger, and he stared aghast at this blackness creeping over the day. Then he realized that it was an eclipse. One by one, the white peaks of the distant hills vanished. A horror of the thickening darkness came upon him. The sky was absolutely black. The cold smote to his marrow, and a deadly nausea seized him. The time traveler closed his eyes. He seemed almost to have stopped breathing. Then he looked at us.
So, I came back. The blinking succession of the days and nights was resumed. The sun got golden again, the sky blue. I saw dim shadows of houses. Finally, the old walls of the laboratory came round me. I was home. I can't expect you to believe this. Take it as a lie or a prophecy. Say I dreamed it in the workshop.
We were bewildered. We didn't know what to say. Rather embarrassed, we said our goodbyes and left, uncertain of ourselves, unable to come to any conclusion. We took a cab to our respective homes. My friend, a medical man, thought the time traveler was suffering from overwork and laughed hugely. I remember him standing on the pavement and bawling good night.
Good night! Good night!
But the next day, I went to see the time traveler again. He was not in the smoking room, so I proceeded down to the laboratory. A gust of wind whirled round me as I opened the door. There was a crash of glass. I seemed to see a confused mass of black and brass for a moment. Then suddenly the phantasm vanished as I rubbed my eyes. The time machine had gone. One cannot choose but wonder. The time traveler vanished 3 years ago. And as everybody knows now, he has never returned. It may be that he swept back into the past and fell among the blood-drinking, hairy savages of the age of unpolished stone. Or among the grotesque saurians, the huge reptilian brutes of the Jurassic times. Or did he go forward into one of the nearer ages, in which men are still men, but with the riddles of our time and its wearisome problems solved?